Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive here on the Elemental Health Podcast.
Glad to be back.
I am too. It's so great to connect with you all again.
Absolutely.
And today we're going to get into something that's just so fundamental to, I think, how we experience life and how we experience, all of our relationships, and that is attachment styles.
Yeah.
And so in this deep dive, what we want to really do is explore how those early emotional connections that we form, really kind of lay the groundwork and shape the patterns that we then see playing out in our relationships in adulthood, whether those are our romantic partnerships or friendships or, even how we navigate things at work.
Right.
And most importantly, we want to explore how we can move toward cultivating healthier and more secure ways of connecting with the people in our lives.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of times, we can find ourselves in relationships and relationship patterns that feel very familiar.
Yeah.
And sometimes those patterns are, welcome and great. But a lot of times we can find ourselves in these familiar patterns and be like, gosh, why does this keep happening?
Right.
And so understanding attachment theory can really be a powerful lens to kind of look back and see why these patterns are happening.
Mm-hmm.
So, attachment theory at its heart, I mean, really when we're talking about attachment style, we're talking about how we behave in our closest relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And those behaviors really often have their roots in the very first bond that we form as infants, typically with our primary caregiver.
Right. And so much research has pointed to how important those early interactions are. I mean, not just for meeting our basic needs, like food and shelter, but for, our emotional development, for how we learn to connect and relate with others.
Absolutely.
And, there's all this research about how those early experiences actually shape our brains. So it's not just like an esoteric concept. Like
Right.
this really has a tangible impact on, who we become.
Right. Yeah. And it really centered around, John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. Their work was really groundbreaking in helping us to understand how important those early connections are and how they really lay the foundation for, our relationships throughout life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And their research, it really showed us that the quality of that initial bond, it's like it creates this template, this sort of blueprint for our future relationships. So, for example, if as infants, our caregivers really consistently made us feel safe and understood, and they really responded to our needs with, love and care.
Yeah.
We're much more likely to develop what they call a secure attachment style.
Right. And it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
As we kind of grow into adults,
Right.
how does that play out? So adults with secure attachment, they tend to have a strong sense of self-worth. They trust others relatively easily.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of approach relationships with a sense of optimism and hope.
Mm-hmm.
They're comfortable with intimacy,
Mm-hmm.
but they can also handle conflict in really healthy ways.
Right. They kind of have that balance, They
Yeah.
value the closeness,
Yeah,
but they're not threatened by their partner's independence or, even their own independence.
exactly.
Right.
It feels safe for them
Yeah.
to have, space
Mm-hmm.
and to have closeness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they don't kind of overreact to that,
Right.
to those shifts. So
Either.
so that's kind of like the picture of secure attachment. But now I think what a lot of people are probably wondering is like, okay, but what happens when those early caregiving experiences aren't as consistent or don't quite meet a child's needs in that reliable and attuned way?
Yeah, that's where insecure attachment styles can develop.
Mm-hmm.
And if the emotional environment in infancy, if it felt confusing or frightening or unpredictable, that can lead to difficulties in understanding and managing emotions, both our own and others' emotions.
Right.
And that could then really lead to challenges in forming and maintaining those stable and fulfilling relationships that we really all crave as adults.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because it's not, people often think that it's like, if someone was abused or neglected,
Right.
that's what leads to insecure attachment, but it's actually a lot more subtle than that.
Yeah, it's much more nuanced than that.
Mm.
And it's really about whether the caregivers were emotionally attuned and consistently meeting those needs. And a lot of times, parents love their children,
Right.
but they might not have the tools
Mhm.
or the knowledge or the resources to really know how to provide that really emotionally safe and attuned environment.
Right.
And so, for example, if there's a parent who struggles with depression,
Mm-hmm.
that can lead to, some withdrawal and inconsistency
Right.
in caregiving.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't mean that they don't love their child,
Right.
but it can make it difficult to really be there in that consistent way that an infant needs
Mm-hmm.
to develop that sense of security.
Yeah. And, even things like, having to go back to work right away or not having, adequate parental leave or,
Yeah.
support from a partner or from family members can create that environment where it's hard to
Yeah,
to really be there for a baby in that
um,
consistent way.
absolutely.
Right.
And it can also, stem from the caregiver's own attachment patterns.
Oh,
A
right.
lot of times we just kind of repeat the patterns that we learned,
Yes.
and so if the caregiver didn't have secure attachment in their childhood, they may not really have those skills
Mm-hmm.
to really pass on that sense of security to their child.
Mm-hmm. So for someone with an insecure attachment style, how might that show up for them? Like, what are some of the ways that that can manifest in their adult relationships?
Well, it can show up in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to remember that, those early years are influential,
Yeah.
but they're not the whole story.
Right.
I mean, our experiences throughout life and our other significant relationships can also shape how we attach.
Mm-hmm.
But that initial bond does lay a really powerful foundation.
Yes.
And so I think it's really helpful to think about, if you're listening and you're like, I wonder if this is playing out in my relationships. It might be helpful to kind of reflect on, do you find yourself behaving in ways that are maybe puzzling to you or self-sabotaging in your relationships?
Right.
Do you find yourself repeating the same mistakes in your romantic relationships?
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that it's difficult for a way to really form meaningful connections?
Yes.
And if the answer to those is yes,
Mm-hmm.
it might be something worth exploring further.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point
Mhm.
because we often go through life and we have these patterns, we have these ways of relating,
Right.
and it's not how we really take a step back and really look at it and maybe have, a therapist or a trusted friend or partner really kind of help us to see those patterns
Mm.
that we can really start to make different choices.
Right. I think that's really the key,
Mm-hmm.
because it can be so discouraging to feel like, oh my gosh, I keep doing this.
Yeah.
I keep
Yeah.
picking the wrong partners or I keep sabotaging things. But what's really hopeful is that our brains can change.
Mm.
We have what's called neuroplasticity.
Yes.
And so by understanding our attachment style, that's really that first step
Mm.
towards starting to foster healthier relationships.
Yes. And I think what we're going to do now is really break down those different attachment styles
Mhm.
because, within this broader understanding of secure versus insecure attachment, research has actually identified 4 main attachment styles.
Right.
And so, we've talked about secure attachment, but the other 3 are what are called anxious attachment, which is sometimes called ambivalent attachment,
Right.
avoidant dismissive attachment,
Mm-hmm.
and then finally disorganized attachment, which we'll kind of unpack a bit later.
Right. And I think just to, kind of make sure we're all on the same page, it might be helpful to just revisit secure attachment.
Yes, let's do that.
Kind of really solidify our understanding.
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about secure attachment, in terms of like what that looks like in adult relationships,
Yeah.
what are some of those key characteristics?
So some of those key characteristics are, as we talked about, they tend to be empathetic,
Mm-hmm.
and they're also typically really good at establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries,
Yeah.
which is essential for any thriving relationship.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to feel safe and content in their close connections,
Mm-hmm.
and they value intimacy, but they also respect their own needs
Yeah.
for independence as well as their partner's needs.
Mm-hmm. So they're not kind of enmeshed or
Yeah, there's that healthy kind of balance.
that healthy interdependence.
Yeah.
So if we were to actually kind of zoom in on, the day-to-day of what it might look like to be in a relationship with someone who has a secure attachment style,
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the things that we might observe?
You might observe that they're willing to take responsibility when they make a mistake,
Mm-hmm.
that they feel comfortable reaching out for support from their partner when they need it,
Mm-hmm.
that they value their self-worth,
Yeah.
that they don't feel a need to kind of play games or manipulate.
Right.
They're able to express their feelings, their needs, their aspirations
Mm-hmm.
in a very, straightforward and authentic way.
Right.
They enjoy spending time with their partner.
Mm-hmm.
They cherish that connection,
Mm-hmm.
but they also don't, get super worried or discussed when they're apart.
Right.
They're happy to offer support,
Mm.
be a reliable partner,
Mm-hmm.
and they can navigate disagreements,
Yeah.
in constructive ways.
Mhm.
So they tend to have a lot more resilience in the face of those challenges.
Right. So it really sounds like that foundation was laid, early on,
Yeah.
where they had a caregiver who was pretty consistently attuned and was good at managing their own stress.
Right.
And, soothed their distress and really created that sense of like,
Yeah.
okay, the world is a safe place.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that it's not about perfection.
Right.
No parent is perfect.
Right. And no child is perfect.
Right, and no child is perfect.
Right.
But it's really about that consistent effort to really try to understand the child's needs and respond to them in a caring and attuned way.
So that's that secure attachment. Now let's move into, one of the insecure attachment styles, and let's talk about anxious attachment.
Okay?
So what are kind of the defining characteristics of anxious attachment?
Yeah, so anxious attachment, like you mentioned earlier, is sometimes called ambivalent attachment
Right.
or anxious preoccupied,
Mm-hmm.
and it often presents as a deep neediness.
Yeah.
So individuals with this style tend to experience a lot of worry and uncertainty
Right.
in their relationships,
Mm-hmm.
and they often struggle with feelings of low self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
They really, really crave that intimacy and that closeness,
Mm-hmm.
but they also simultaneously have this fear that their partner doesn't truly want that same level of closeness,
Right.
and they might live.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's this constant need for reassurance,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not just about seeking validation. It's really coming from this very deep-seated fear
Right.
that their worthiness is conditional
Mm-hmm.
and that it really depends on external approval.
Mm-hmm. So it's like they're always kind of looking outside of themselves for that sense of worth and value.
Yeah, and a lot of times that pattern starts really early on.
Mm-hmm.
If you think back to that early caregiving experience,
Yeah.
where, sometimes the caregiver was very responsive and loving and engaged, but then other times they were emotionally unavailable or distracted.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of creates this sense of like, okay, when is that love going to be there?
Right.
When is it going to be safe?
Mm-hmm.
And so you kind of grow up with this almost like hypervigilance
Yeah.
around, am I loved? Am I going to be abandoned? Do I have to do something to earn this love?
Mm. Right. And so then how does that translate into, the actual behaviors that we might see in a relationship?
Yeah, so you might see that they're very clingy.
Mm-hmm.
They're constantly seeking reassurance of their partner's love and commitment. They might have a really difficult time trusting their partner
Right.
and really kind of leaning into that relationship.
Right. We're always kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And they might find that, they get so caught up in the relationship
Mm-hmm.
that it really becomes the center of their life,
Mm-hmm.
and they're constantly preoccupied with, where is my partner?
Right.
What are they doing? What are they feeling?
Mm-hmm.
And boundaries could be really challenging
Yeah.
for someone with this style because any sense of distance
Yeah.
or independence on the part of the partner,
Yeah.
it feels very threatening.
Right.
It feels like, oh my gosh, I'm being abandoned,
Yeah. Right.
And their sense of self-worth can really get very tied up
Mm-hmm.
in how they feel they're being treated by their partner.
Right. So any perceived slight,
Yeah.
any, little miscommunication.
Yeah. It can feel like a huge rejection.
Right. And it's not that they're being dramatic. It's that they're experiencing it that way.
Exactly.
Like, right.
Because of that early patterning.
Right. So they're always kind of like scanning for
Yeah.
threats or rejection. And
Yeah.
they might experience significant anxiety
Oh, absolutely.
when they're apart from their partner.
Yeah.
Right. Or if their partner doesn't respond to a text right away. Or
Right. And that can lead to, a lot of, attempts to kind of keep the partner close,
Right.
which unfortunately can sometimes push the partner away.
Right. So it's like that self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Where it's like their fear is causing them to act in a way that then
Mm-hmm.
push their partner away, which then confirms their fear.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it can be a really difficult cycle to break.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, people with anxious attachment, they might hear from, friends or family members, like, you're too needy.
Right.
You're
yeah.
too clingy. And that can, unfortunately, just really reinforce those fears.
Right. Yeah. And it's not that they're intentionally trying to be that way.
Right, exactly.
Right. It's that it's coming from that place of that deep insecurity.
Yeah.
And so, we talk about how this can kind of stem from that inconsistent parenting,
Yeah.
where sometimes the caregiver was responsive, sometimes unavailable.
Right.
What are some other, potential causes that might lead someone to develop this style?
Well, sometimes it can be, if the caregiver themselves was struggling with anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
that can kind of get passed on,
Yeah.
just through the modeling.
Right. Yeah, because babies are like little sponges.
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
picking up on everything.
Yeah, they're very attuned to the emotional state of their caregivers.
Yeah, so it's not just the behaviors, it's the
It's the energy.
the energy.
Right.
Yeah.
The emotional climate of the home.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes it can also be, things that maybe were well-intentioned but ended up creating that inconsistency. Like,
Mhm.
if a caregiver was really trying to encourage independence,
Right.
but maybe pushed the child a little too hard or too fast before they were ready.
Yeah, and that could be especially challenging for, more sensitive children who
Right.
really need that extra reassurance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, for anyone listening who might be recognizing some of these patterns in themselves,
Yeah.
it's important to really have compassion for yourself and to understand that, these are patterns that we develop as a way to survive.
Hmm.
And they served us at one point, but they might not be serving us anymore.
Exactly.
Right.
And the good news is, like we talked about earlier, we can change them.
Yes.
We can learn new ways of relating.
Mm-hmm.
We can heal those old wounds
Mm-hmm.
and start to create more secure and fulfilling relationships.
Mm-hmm. So that's anxious attachment, and we're going to get into some specific strategies and tools
Yeah.
a little bit later for how to actually start to make those changes. But first, I want to talk about the other end of the spectrum,
Okay.
which is avoidant dismissive attachment.
Hmm.
And how is that, different from anxious attachment?
Yeah, avoidant dismissive attachment is, in many ways, like you say, on the other end of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of seeking out closeness,
Mm-hmm.
they tend to be very wary of intimacy
Right.
and actively avoid deep emotional connection with others.
Mm-hmm.
And, we often associate, attachment with that need for closeness.
Right.
But it's really about that need for security.
Right.
And so for someone with avoidant dismissive attachment, their way of getting that sense of security
Mm-hmm.
is through being independent
Yeah.
and self-sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
And they really place a high value on those qualities.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't like to rely on others.
Yeah.
And they also really don't want others to rely on them
Right.
too much.
Right. So in their minds, it's like, if I don't need anyone, then I can't be hurt.
Exactly. I'm safe.
Yeah, it's like that protective mechanism.
Exactly.
So, what might be some practical examples of how this shows up in everyday life? Like, how might we see this play out?
Yeah, well, one thing you might notice is they might consistently avoid making plans,
Okay.
beyond a few days out,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe their partner's like, hey, let's plan this trip,
Yeah.
or let's, make these plans for the holidays.
Mm-hmm.
And they might be very resistant to that.
Right. Or they might kind of hedge and be like, well, let's see.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
You know?
We'll see how things are going.
Yeah, and I think another way it can show up is they might get really uncomfortable
Mm-hmm.
when their partner tries to initiate deeper emotional conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe their partner's trying to be vulnerable
Yeah.
and share something, personal or difficult,
Right.
and they might change the subject
Right.
or kind of get physically distant.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not because they don't care.
Right.
It's because it feels threatening to them.
Right. It's like that closeness is triggering
Yeah.
that old fear
Exactly.
of being engulfed or trapped.
Right.
Yeah. So then in their, broader adult relationships, romantic relationships, friendships,
Yeah.
what are some of the things that we might see from someone with this avoidant dismissive style?
Yeah. Well, like I was saying, they often find emotional intimacy very difficult
Mm-hmm.
to tolerate,
Yeah.
and it can feel uncomfortable,
Mm,
even suffocating to them,
right.
to have that level of selfness.
Right.
They really do pride themselves on being self-reliant and independent.
Right.
And that can be a real strength in some ways.
Mhm.
They're often very capable
Yeah.
and resourceful.
Right.
But it can also be a barrier to
Yeah.
intimacy.
Yeah. Because true intimacy requires that vulnerability,
Absolutely.
right? That letting someone in.
Yeah.
And that can feel really scary for someone
Yeah.
with this style.
And so, what can happen is when their partner tries to get close emotionally
Mm-hmm.
or becomes, what they perceive as needy,
Yeah.
they tend to withdraw
Mm.
even more.
Right. It's almost like they can only tolerate a certain amount of
Yeah, exactly.
vigilanteness.
Yeah, there's like a limit.
Yeah.
And once that limit is reached, they're like, I need to get out of here,
Right. And sometimes it's a physical getting out of there. Sometimes it's an emotional, shutting down.
Exactly.
Right.
So, they might be uncomfortable expressing their own emotions.
Yeah.
And, sometimes partners of people with this style will describe them as being, distant or
Right.
closed off or cold.
Right.
That could be really hurtful,
Yeah.
you know, because it's not that they don't have feelings. It's
Yeah.
that they've learned to suppress them,
Yeah.
as a way to protect themselves.
Yeah. It's like they're almost allergic to.
Like
Right.
those strong emotions.
Exactly.
Right.
And so they'll also, sometimes minimize their partner's feelings.
Right.
They'll be like, oh, you're being too sensitive.
Right.
Or, it's not a big deal.
Right.
And again, it's not because they don't care.
Right.
It's because it's uncomfortable for them
Right.
to deal with those big emotions.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to kind of keep things very even-keeled.
Right. Very regulated.
Yeah, very regulated.
Yeah.
And so they might keep secrets.
Mm-hmm.
They might have affairs.
Right.
Or they might end relationships as a way to regain that sense of autonomy
Right.
and independence.
Yeah. So it's like any threat to their freedom
Yeah,
feels like
huge threat.
Right.
And so they might, be drawn to partners who are equally independent,
Mm-hmm.
who kind of keep that distance.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that, even though on the surface it might seem like they don't need close relationships.
Mm-hmm. The reality is that as humans, we are wired for connection.
Right.
And even people with avoidant dismissive attachment, they often have this underlying longing for connection.
Yeah.
But they're just really afraid of the vulnerability
Right.
that comes with it.
Yeah. So they're kind of caught in this
Yeah.
push and pull.
Yeah.
Right.
Of wanting closeness, but also fearing it.
Yeah. So, we talked about anxious attachment stemming from that inconsistent parenting where it was kind of back and forth. What about avoidant dismissive attachment? What's kind of the root there?
Yeah. So this style often develops when the primary caregiver was consistently unavailable or rejecting,
Mm-hmm.
During infancy.
Mm-hmm.
And so the child learns to suppress their needs.
Right.
They learn to kind of distance themselves emotionally.
Mm.
And they learn to rely on self-soothing mechanisms.
Right, because if they can't get that comfort from the caregiver, they have to
Right.
figure out another way to
Exactly.
soothe themselves.
Yeah. And that could be, anything from, just kind of withdrawing into themselves to, developing hobbies or interests that kind of allow them to escape,
Right.
that emotional discomfort.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because sometimes those coping mechanisms are actually really positive things.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Like, being independent and resourceful
Mm-hmm.
is great, but when it becomes so extreme
Yeah.
that it prevents you from having intimacy,
Yeah, exactly.
then it becomes a problem.
Right.
Yeah, and it's like they're almost rejecting intimacy before they can be rejected.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so it's like that preemptive,
It's like that wall goes up
yeah.
as a way to protect themselves
Yeah.
from getting hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that could even, come out as anger,
Right,
towards the partner.
right.
When the partner's trying to get close, they might get angry or irritable.
Right, yeah. It's like, why are you trying to...
Yeah, back off.
Right.
Give me my space.
Right. Yeah, and it can be really confusing for the partner.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, because they're like, I'm just trying to love you,
Right.
and the other person is like, I don't want your love.
Yeah, I don't need it,
Right,
And it's not that they literally don't need it.
right.
It's that they've learned to convince themselves.
Yeah, that they don't.
Yeah.
Right, so that's avoidant dismissive attachment. And now I think, we have to talk about this last one, which is often considered the most complex,
Mm.
and that is a disorganized attachment.
Yeah, so disorganized attachment, which is sometimes called fearful avoidant attachment,
Mm-hmm.
is, as you said, it's often considered the most complex.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because it brings together those elements of both anxiety and avoidance.
Right.
So it's like they're both terrified of intimacy,
Mm-hmm.
but also desperately craving it.
Right, and we talked about, avoid dismissive folks having that longing, but also that fear.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like with disorganized, it's even more.
It's much more heightened.
Yeah, it's more intense.
Intense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it often stems from experiences of intense fear in childhood.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about, often trauma or neglect or abuse,
Right.
Things that were really, truly terrifying for a child.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about this style is this concept of fear without a solution.
Mm-hmm.
So often the caregiver was both a source of comfort
Right.
and a source of fear.
Right. So it's like the person who's supposed to protect you
Mhm.
is also the person who's hurting you.
Exactly.